Hello guys, this is Mr. Cole. Another video today. This one should be shorter, regarding how the Vietnam War changed life at home as we kind of continue on talking about the protest movement against the war. What we have happened in the 1960s here during the Vietnam War is a total just rejection from some people of American culture and the way of life that we had, and it emerged from this anti-war protest movement. If you remember, we had talked last time, as I scroll on back, which, by the way, I'm sorry I went out of order on the notes. I know it's annoying. You guys can figure it out. But we talked about how the Doves and the Hawks really split the country in two, between the younger anti-war side and the kind of the older pro-war side, right? But you also have to consider who these folks are. The Hawks, the traditionally older group who were in favor of the war, these were the people who fought during World War II, or at least, at the very least, were alive during World War II, and kind of saw America in a lot different way than the young people did, right? These Doves, the people that we now know as the Boomers, right? These guys were folks who were not alive during World War II. They didn't live through this kind of, moment in American history where we were the leader of the world who saved the world from all these tyranny and problems, right? So they have two totally different visions of America. And with that, what you're going to have happen is these Doves, some will eventually decide to completely reject American culture and just form their own counterculture. The counterculture, counter meaning against, so against the culture, was a movement of mostly white middle-class young college-age kids who were so disillusioned by the war that they just completely reject the traditional way of life. When I say the traditional way of life, I mean the perfect 1950s and 1960s family that we've talked about in previous units, right? Where, mom and dad and 2 or 3 kids, and you go out for picnics and you have the white picket fence, right? That version of America, they are starting to reject, okay? We primarily call these folks the hippies. The hippies obviously starting as the anti-war. That's the number one way hippie against the war in Vietnam and against war in total. But really, it grows to being totally anti-establishment, meaning against the established way of life, the established government that we have, just the traditional ways that we live. Okay? One of those being our economic system of capitalism, which all of us compete against each other for jobs and money. They're rejecting that. They're rejecting the way that we, live our lives. They also start to reject many of the gender norms and the norms of what it meant to be a man or a woman. You see during the 1960s a sexual revolution take place of, free love, okay? You also see, as part of this anti-establishment, the widespread use among hippies of drugs and the idea that drugs are something that the establishment says is bad, and so they want to reject that. The widespread free love sex was something that the establishment said was bad. That's not traditional, so they reject it. The kind of hippie capital of the world was the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. San Francisco kind of becomes the hippie kind of central location. And the famous peace, love, and rock and roll of the 1960s hippie movement. Just to show you some of the counterculture and some of the hippies. So here's just a group of them. So these are, again, you can see how young most of them are. Riding in very colorful clothing and a painted colorful bus. People like this, they would just kind of travel around the country in communities and just kind of camp out or hitchhike or whatever. Don't have jobs. Everybody's just helping each other out, living in their own little counterculture community, right? This is horrifying for the parents of the 1950s, right? This is terrifying. The baby boomers' parents are sitting there going, holy cow, what is happening, right? This is like your parents' worst nightmare, to see your kid become a hippie and just leave their life that they had, leave college, leave their job, and go travel around the country. Crazy for that. Here's another one, right? You can see, just widespread groups of, young people who have become so disillusioned with America that they just reject the way of life. Here's one of the famous pictures of the hippies. This one at a protest of putting flowers in the soldiers' guns. I always think that's the pretty cool picture to show. And again, it's all about that peace idea about the war. Now, with this, you cannot talk about the 1960s counterculture in Vietnam without bringing up and referencing the rock music that was inspired by the counterculture. Rock and roll had been around since the 1950s, but what you really see in the 1960s is that rock becomes the way of kind of expressing the counterculture ideals. Through the protest music, through many bands. I'll show you some in a second. But the most famous event, of course, of the rock and roll movement in the 1960s was Woodstock. Woodstock was a gathering of tens of thousands of people at a concert just out in some farm in New York. And it just exploded. Hippies from all over the country kind of came together in one place for 3 days of peace and music, just camping outside. It poured down rain, so everybody's just all muddy, and there's just peace, love, and music. And that's just kind of like the central cultural event of the hippie movement was Woodstock. And a lot of very famous 1960s musicians performed at it, again, as part of this kind of rejecting, the traditional way of life. Now, I don't think anybody really symbolizes the 1960s and the reaction to the Vietnam War better than the Beatles. Here were the Beatles when they came over to America in 1961, 62, 63, somewhere right around there. You can see, kind of dressed like old 1950s, 1960s style, nice haircut, nice shirt and tie, the way people dressed. Here they are by the end of the 1960s. You can see that the Beatles music went from songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand to songs that were much more psychedelic and definitely dealt with a lot more complex issues. And with that, it kind of shows that rejection that's happening of that normal way of life. Ultimately, though, what you'll really see end up happening is that the counterculture movement actually leads to the average American turning to more traditional style. If you're that middle American, you are just the normal average American, okay? And you have to decide between the conservative traditional side or the younger, more change side. As you see all these young people being hippies, that actually drives a lot of people to the conservative side. And actually, you will see that this big counterculture movement is actually going to lead to a conservative era of almost 20 plus years in American history of people kind of rejecting that young hippie ideals for a more conservative president. Okay, so with that, we will talk about that though in our next video. So there it was, a little bit on the counterculture and all the hippies. So go listen to some 1960s music, okay? All right, see you guys.